Welcome back to NewsX World. I am Pia and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Now, Israel is mobilizing more troops for its largest push yet into Gaza City, while warnings of urban combat are growing and the humanitarian toll is escalating. With nearly 1 million displaced, aid agencies are warning of famine and accusing Israel of collective punishment. Moreover, mass protests by hostage families and citizens are straining government policy. As it expands settlements in the West Bank, Israel faces growing international criticism and diplomatic isolation. Joining us now is Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesperson, who was the spokesperson during the heinous October 7 terror attack and the head of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office. He is the host of the State of a Nation podcast and has previously served as international media advisor to President Isaac Herzog. Today, he discusses Israel's military push into Gaza City, the humanitarian crisis, the pressure from mass domestic protests and the challenges of growing international criticism amid settlement expansion. Thank you so much for joining us, Eylon Levy. My very first question to you is that Israel has mobilized 130,000 troops for its largest push into Gaza City, where there are warnings of drawn-out urban combat. Why was such a large operation in Gaza City seen as necessary despite the risks of long urban warfare?
Well, nearly 2 years into the war that Hamas started with the October 7th massacre, the Hamas regime in Gaza is still refusing to release all of the hostages, and it's still refusing to give up power and disarm as the whole world is demanding. And Israel wants to end this war. We don't want a forever war. We want this war to be over. And this war can only end when Hamas is removed from power and returns all of the hostages, or else we're going to be trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence. So Israel is telling Hamas now, you must accept the demands of the entire world. Free all the hostages, give up power, relinquish your arms, and allow everyone to move on. And if you will not do that voluntarily, then Israel will capture Hamas's last stronghold, Gaza City, doing everything it can to minimize harm to civilians and to remove that terrorist regime from power and force it to release those hostages back to their families.
All right, a quick follow-up. Nearly 1 million Palestinians are being displaced and a lot of shortages of food, of water and medicine have now been reported as well. How does Israel justify its campaign, especially when the humanitarian toll in Gaza is worsening daily?
Israel understands that if this war does not end with the end of the Hamas regime, the next war is a matter of time. And that's because Hamas is a jihadi regime that is sworn to Israel's destruction. And if this war ends with Hamas still in power, still holding hostages, still hiding in tunnels, then it will prepare for the next war and the next October 7th massacre, and we will see it invade again and try to take hostages from their homes. So the question now is, how do you remove Hamas from power? And no one is doubting that the toll on civilians in Gaza has been very serious. But that's why Israel is urging them to get out of harm's way. It's telling civilians, Hamas is fighting out of a network of tunnels under your feet. Hamas dug 500 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza in schools and homes and mosques and hospitals. And we don't want you to be hurt. We don't want terrorists to use you as human shields, as human sacrifices. So please move to places where Hamas is not in control, where you can get humanitarian aid and we can establish field hospitals and make sure that your needs are taken care of. And then Israel can fight Hamas without any civilians in the way. And I think all leaders around the world who truly care about the humanitarian situation in Gaza should be working with Israel to make sure that civilians can get to safety and not keep them trapped in strongholds, Hamas strongholds, where terrorists are trying to hide behind them.
All right. Meanwhile, aid agencies are warning of famine and are accusing Israel of collective punishment as infrastructure is collapsing. How would you respond to claims that Israel is collectively punishing civilians in Gaza?
Look, we're seeing a really malicious political campaign now to try to force Israel to end the war with Hamas still in power. Let's look at the facts. Since May, Israel has let in over 9,000 trucks of aid into Gaza. Since the beginning of the war, nearly 2 million tons of aid. There is no other example in history of a country facilitating so many supplies into enemy-held territory when we know that the enemy is hijacking it and taxing it and still holding hostages. But that is what Israel is doing to try to keep Palestinian civilians safe. In fact, just yesterday, the Israeli government approved $500 million of Israeli taxpayer money in order to feed the people in Gaza, because this is a war against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza. But yes, there is a hunger crisis in Gaza. There is a hunger crisis in Gaza because the Hamas government of Gaza has been hijacking aid for its own fighters and for its own people. And because there has been a catastrophic collapse of the UN aid distribution system. According to the UN's own figures, and you can go to the UN website yourself and check this, nearly 90% of aid trucks are getting hijacked along the way. They're not reaching their warehouses. And that is why Israel is now leading an international coalition of countries to airdrop aid into Gaza and make sure it reaches civilians. It's why Israel is working with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American initiative, to get aid directly to the people who need it and make sure that Hamas cannot steal it. And anyone who really cares about the humanitarian situation in Gaza needs to be helping Israel do exactly that. Get food to people who need it, and make sure that the Hamas regime cannot steal it in order to continue financing its war machine and continuing the war it should have ended a long time ago.
All right, we've spoken about a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism that is coming from outside Israel, but domestically speaking as well, large protests are spreading across Tel Aviv, Haifa and Jerusalem, involving hostage families, reservists and citizens who are quite frustrated with the war. How much pressure do these particular protests put on the government's war policy and decision making?
Indeed, we've seen some very inspiring protests in Israel, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in a statement of solidarity with the hostage families. I think it's an amazing show of how much Israelis care for each other. There is a core part of Israel's national ethos that says you don't leave anyone behind, you have to take care of everyone. And that's why people are coming out to the streets to demand that a deal is made. But you know, while Israel is now reviewing the offer that Hamas has made in the ransom talks, international pressure needs to be on Hamas to accept a ceasefire that ends the war completely. The hostage families do not want a partial deal that freezes the war and lets out only half of the hostages. They want all the hostages home. But Hamas doesn't want to release all the hostages because Hamas sees the hostages as insurance that it can continue to govern in Gaza. Even when the whole world is saying Hamas must give up power, it must give up its arms, Hamas is holding onto hostages. 20 of them are still alive, starving them, torturing them in tunnels under Gaza, torturing their families to try to keep them as insurance to survive the war that it started. And we need the whole world to pressure Hamas and its backers, Qatar, Turkey, Iran. It must release the hostages immediately and unconditionally. There is no excuse to hold them at all for a single moment longer.
All right, and speaking of Israel's allies, traditional allies are now becoming critical, with Europe now considering embargoes and sanctions as well. What message should Israel send to allies who argue that the war is becoming indefensible?
Well, the message Israel is sending to its allies is that they should stop buckling to internal political pressure. We've seen massive internal protests in the West, civil disobedience, mass street protests and demonstrations, including from large and growing Muslim populations. And Western leaders have buckled. They've decided to try to throw Israel under a bus, basically, to appease their own audiences. But it doesn't help, because Western pressure on Israel to end the war is only encouraging Hamas to prolong the war. Look at what happened just 2 weeks ago. The ceasefire talks collapsed. the day that President Macron said he would recognize a Palestinian state, which rewards Hamas for the October 7th massacre, which encourages more barbaric atrocities like we saw on October 7th, because it's saying terrorism works. So Israel is very disappointed with its allies. It knows that if, God forbid, they were ever to suffer such a horrific invasion like October 7th, they would not allow a jihadi regime to continue to rule on their borders. Israel would certainly not undermine their efforts to get hostages back. It would not sabotage those ceasefire talks. And Western countries need to stand together with Israel and put the pressure on Hamas, the jihadi organization that started this war and is refusing to end this war, to release all the hostages, lay down its arms, and allow the whole Middle East to move on towards a future of peace.
All right, my last and final question. Israel has revived the E1 project in the West Bank, approving thousands of new homes that critics say cut off prospects for a two-state solution. So why move ahead with settlement expansion now, especially when Israel is already under intense global scrutiny?
No, I think the E1 project is a lot of manufactured hype over nothing. If you look at it on a map, we're talking about a couple of kilometers. It's a very small area. And it's a small area that connects Israel's capital city, Jerusalem, to a suburb just outside it, Ma'ale Adumim. That's a city. It's never going to be separated from Jerusalem. Israel is never going to divide Jerusalem, and it certainly needs a protective buffer around its capital city. After October 7th, Israel is not going to give strategic territory next to its capital city to the same people who perpetrated the October 7th massacre and are promising more and more war against Israel until this country is destroyed. I think it's important that we have a peace process with the Palestinians, but that peace process has to come through the Palestinians recognizing that the Jewish state of Israel has a right to exist and it's not going anywhere. And the Jewish people are exercising their right to self-determination in their ancient homeland. And if they accept that, then the sky's the limit for peace.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Eylon Levy, for speaking to us on Focal Length. And with that, it's a wrap on this particular episode. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.